The wrench slipped from Jake Morrison's grease-stained fingers for the third time that morning, clattering against the hover car's exposed repulsion coils with a metallic ping that echoed through his cramped garage. He muttered a particularly creative curse involving Centaurian slug anatomy and wiped his hands on coveralls that had seen better decades. The ancient Delacroix sedan floating 3 feet off his workshop floor had been giving him grief all week, its quantum stabilizers about as reliable as a politician's campaign promises. "Come on, you glorified paperweight," he grumbled, crawling back under the vehicle's chassis. "Your owner needs you to stop randomly dropping out of hover mode during family dinners. It's embarrassing enough that she drives a car older than most of the colony's founding documents." The morning sun of New Haven streamed through the garage's reinforced windows, casting long shadows across scattered tools and spare parts. Outside, the frontier colony was beginning its daily routine, merchants setting up their stalls in the town square, children racing their toy speeders down the main thoroughfare, and the ever-present hum of atmospheric processors working to maintain the delicate balance that made this rock habitable. It was peaceful, predictable, and exactly the kind of boring that Jake had learned to appreciate after 7 years of hiding in plain sight. He'd almost managed to convince himself that this was enough. That fixing hover cars and helping elderly colonists navigate the complexities of modern transportation technology was a perfectly respectable way to spend the rest of his life. Sure, it wasn't quite the same rush as negotiating trade agreements between star systems or defusing diplomatic crises that could reshape entire sectors, but it had its perks. No one shot at him anymore, for starters. Well, except for Mrs. Patterson when he'd accidentally programmed her car's navigation system to speak only in ancient Rigelian poetry, but that had been more therapeutic than life-threatening. The communicator on his workbench chirped with an incoming message, probably another customer complaining about mysterious rattling sounds or unexpected color changes in their vehicle's exterior plating. He ignored it and focused on the tangle of fiber-optic nerves that served as the car's nervous system, each strand carrying instructions that would have seemed like magic to his great-grandfather. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who'd once helped draft interstellar peace treaties now spent his days playing therapist to neurotic transportation devices. The workshop's main door chimed as someone entered, and Jake called out without looking up, "If it's about the Martinez family's cargo hauler, I told them Tuesday at the earliest." Those industrial-grade motivators don't exactly grow on trees, especially not on a frontier world where the nearest part supplier is 3 jumps away. "Actually, I was hoping you could take a look at my ship's environmental controls," came a familiar voice that made Jake's blood turn to ice water. "They've been acting up something terrible, and I'd hate to suffocate in space." Again. Jake's head connected with the hover car's undercarriage hard enough to see stars, both literal and metaphorical. He rolled out from under the vehicle, rubbing his skull and blinking away tears, to find Sarah Chen standing in his doorway with a grin that suggested she was enjoying his pain far more than friendship strictly warranted. "Sarah, you magnificent disaster," he wheezed, hauling himself to his feet. "One of these days your idea of humor is going to give me a genuine heart attack, and then you'll have to explain to the colony magistrate why their only decent mechanic died of shock-induced comedy." Sarah was one of the few people on New Haven who knew about his past, mainly because she'd been there for most of it. Former Earth intelligence, currently masquerading as a freelance trader, she made regular stops at the colony to maintain her cover and to torment Jake with reminders of the life he'd left behind. Her ship, a modified courier vessel that looked like a cargo hauler but moved like an interceptor, was currently parked behind his garage where it wouldn't attract unwanted attention. "Your environmental systems are fine," Jake continued, checking his scalp for blood. "You just like watching me suffer. It's probably some kind of character flaw they should have screened for during intelligence training." Says the man who once convinced an entire vegan diplomatic delegation that Earth's traditional greeting involved interpretive dance. Sarah shot back, settling onto a crate of spare parts. "How's the hermit life treating you? Still talking to the hover cars like they're people? They're better conversationalists than most people. And they don't bring up embarrassing stories from my diplomatic career every time they need an oil change." Jake wiped his hands again and gestured toward the coffee maker in the corner, a contraption he'd modified to work with local ingredients. Want some stimulant? I finally figured out how to make it taste less like industrial solvent. Tempting, but I can't stay long. Just wanted to check in before heading back to the core worlds. Make sure you haven't gone completely native and started wearing those awful locally woven shirts the colonists seem to love. Hey, those shirts are comfortable. And they're practical for this climate. Jake activated the coffee maker, which began its familiar routine of concerning mechanical noises. Besides, going native would require me to actually participate in community events instead of hiding in my garage like some kind of antisocial cave dweller. Their easy banter was interrupted by a sound that Jake hadn't heard in years but recognized instantly, the deep, thrumming vibration of massive ships dropping out of hyperspace. The walls of his garage trembled slightly, and several delicate components on his workbench rattled ominously. Both he and Sarah froze, their casual conversation dying as training and instinct kicked in. "That's not a merchant convoy," Sarah said quietly, her hand already moving toward the concealed weapon at her hip. "No," Jake agreed, his mouth suddenly dry. "That's a battle fleet." They moved to the window together, Sarah pulling out a pair of military-grade binoculars while Jake shaded his eyes against the morning sun. In the sky above New Haven, reality was bending and twisting as ship after ship materialized from the impossible depths of hyperspace. Not the crude, boxy vessels of pirates or the sleek but simple designs of Earth's remaining military forces. These were something else entirely, elegant death incarnate, their hulls seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it, their very presence making the air taste of ozone and barely contained energy. "Oh, wonderful," Jake muttered, recognizing the distinctive architecture with the kind of sick certainty that comes from intimate familiarity. "Just absolutely fantastic." "Sarah, please tell me those aren't Dominion ships." Sarah lowered her binoculars, her face pale. "I'd love to, but I've never been a particularly good liar. Those are definitely Dominion ships. A lot of them." "And Jake?" She handed him the binoculars with the careful movements of someone delivering very bad news. "Take a look at the lead vessel's markings." Jake focused the enhanced optics on the largest ship, a massive dreadnought that seemed to warp space around itself like a stone dropped in still water. The crimson insignia blazing across its hull was unmistakable, the twisted spiral of the ethereal Dominion's military command, surrounded by rank markers that indicated someone very important was aboard. "Admiral-class markings," he said, lowering the binoculars with hands that weren't quite steady. "Whoever's commanding this fleet has enough authority to glass a planet and not even file a particularly detailed report about it afterward." In the distance, the colony's emergency sirens began their mournful wail, a sound that sent colonists scurrying for shelter and activated emergency protocols that everyone hoped they'd never need to use. Jake watched through his window as his peaceful adopted home transformed into something approaching controlled chaos, people running in all directions while the local militia tried to establish some kind of defensive perimeter with equipment that might have been intimidating to pirates but would be less than useless against Dominion technology. "I should go," Sarah said, already moving toward the garage's back exit where her ship waited. "Try to get word back to command about this. Maybe rally some kind of response." "With what?" Jake asked, still staring at the sky where more ships continued to materialize. "Earth's fleet is scattered across a dozen systems trying to protect colonies just like this one. By the time any meaningful help arrives, this will either be over or irrelevant." The colony's communication system crackled to life, ancient speakers mounted on buildings throughout the settlement carrying an amplified voice that cut through the sounds of panic and confusion. The voice was speaking in perfect, unaccented English, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had been delivered in the musical tones of the Dominion's native language. "Citizens of New Haven Colony," the voice announced with the kind of calm authority that suggested its owner was accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This is Admiral Zaravel Tereth of the Ethereal Dominion Fleet. Your world has been selected for annexation under Imperial Decree 847 Alpha. Resistance will be met with appropriate force. Cooperation will be rewarded with continued existence. You have 1 standard hour to prepare for the arrival of occupation forces. Jake felt the world shift around him, reality becoming suddenly surreal and impossible. That voice, he knew that voice. Had listened to it whisper promises in the dark, had argued with it across negotiating tables, had heard it laugh at jokes that only they understood. 7 years might have passed, 7 years of deliberately not thinking about her, but some things were burned too deeply into memory to ever truly fade. Jake. Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. Jake, you look like you've seen a ghost. What's wrong? He handed her back the binoculars without looking away from the speakers, his mind reeling with implications and impossibilities and the kind of cosmic irony that suggested the universe had a truly twisted sense of humor. That's not just any admiral, he said quietly. That's my ex-wife. The occupation forces arrived with the kind of punctuality that would have impressed a Swiss clockmaker, assuming Swiss clockmakers had access to gravitic assault platforms and enough firepower to reduce a small moon to its component atoms. Jake watched from his garage window as sleek transport craft descended from the orbital fleet like metallic raindrops, their anti-gravity fields creating perfect circles of flattened grass in the colony's central park. He'd spent the hour since Zara's announcement trying to convince himself that this was all some kind of elaborate nightmare brought on by inhaling too many cleaning solvents. Unfortunately, the steady stream of panicked colonists fleeing past his workshop window suggested that reality was being stubbornly persistent about remaining real. I still can't believe you were married to a Dominion admiral, Sarah muttered from behind a stack of spare parts where she was attempting to modify her ship's transponder codes. I mean, I knew you had questionable taste in romantic partners, but this really takes the quantum cake. Ex-married, Jake corrected automatically. And for the record, she wasn't an admiral when we got divorced. She was barely a lieutenant commander with delusions of grandeur and a tendency to rearrange our furniture according to some incomprehensible alien aesthetic. The first transport touched down in the town square with barely a whisper of displaced air, its boarding ramp extending like a metallic tongue tasting the atmosphere. Soldiers began filing out in perfect formation, their armor gleaming with the kind of technological sophistication that made Earth's military equipment look like it had been assembled by particularly creative children using kitchen utensils. Maybe she won't recognize you, Sarah suggested hopefully. I mean, 7 years is a long time. You've got more gray hair, you've put on a few pounds, and you're covered in enough grease to lubricate a small spacecraft. You're practically a completely different person. Thanks for the confidence boost, Jake replied dryly. Really doing wonders for my already fragile self-esteem. The soldiers were setting up some kind of scanning equipment, cylindrical devices that hummed with barely contained energy and projected holographic interfaces that danced with alien symbols. Jake recognized the technology from his diplomatic days, biometric scanners capable of identifying individuals from DNA traces in the air, heartbeat patterns, even the unique electromagnetic signatures that every sentient brain produced. On second thought, he said, watching the scanners begin their methodical sweep of the colony, I think hiding might be a waste of time. Could always make a run for it, Sarah offered, though her tone suggested she didn't think much of the idea. My ship's fast enough to outrun their local patrols, assuming they don't have any of those new reality anchor missiles that make hyperspace jumps impossible within a 50 light-year radius. And leave all these people to face whatever Zara has planned? That's not exactly the kind of retirement I was hoping for. One of the scanning devices swiveled in their direction, its sensor array focusing on the garage with the patient intensity of a predator that had caught an interesting scent. Jake felt his stomach drop somewhere in the vicinity of his boots as the device's hum grew noticeably louder. Well, he said philosophically, it was nice knowing you, Sarah. Try not to get yourself killed in whatever insane rescue attempt you're probably already planning. Who says I'm planning a rescue attempt? Sarah protested, though the way she was checking her weapon's charge levels rather undermined her denial. Maybe I'll just write a strongly worded letter to Earth Command about the tragic loss of one of their former diplomats. Very sad, much mourning, please send condolences to his next of kin. The garage door suddenly rang with the sharp impact of someone knocking, though the sound had an oddly metallic quality that suggested the someone was wearing powered armor. Jake and Sarah exchanged glances, both of them silently acknowledging that their conversation time had just expired. "Jake Morrison," came a voice from outside, speaking in the clipped tones of someone reading from an official document. "By order of Admiral Veltereth, you are requested to present yourself for immediate escort to the command facility. Compliance is mandatory. Resistance will be noted in your permanent record." "Requested," Jake repeated quietly. "I love how they make it sound optional." "Could be worse," Sarah whispered back. "They could have said, demanded, or required, or surrender immediately, or we'll use you for target practice." Jake opened the door to find 3 Dominion soldiers waiting outside, their armor humming with active energy shields and their weapons held in a kind of relaxed grip that suggested they were very confident about their ability to handle any trouble he might cause. The lead soldier's helmet retracted with a soft hiss, revealing features that were almost human except for the elongated ears that marked her as one of Zara's people. "Mr. Morrison," the soldier said politely. "I am Lieutenant Kira Velnath of the Occupation Forces. The Admiral has requested your immediate presence for what she described as a long overdue conversation about mutual interests and past grievances." "She actually said that?" Jake asked, genuinely curious despite the circumstances. "Those exact words?" The Admiral's actual words were somewhat more colorful, Lieutenant Velnath admitted with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "But I thought a diplomatic translation might be more appropriate for the circumstances. I appreciate the consideration. Give me just a moment to grab my coat and say goodbye to my friend here." "Your friend will be remaining at the garage," the lieutenant informed him firmly. The Admiral was quite specific about this being a private conversation. Jake turned back to Sarah, who was doing her best to look like an innocent bystander despite the fact that her hand was still hovering near her concealed weapon. "Try not to blow anything up while I'm gone," he told her quietly. "And if you don't hear from me in 12 hours, feel free to assume the worst and act accordingly." 12 hours? Sarah protested. "That's barely enough time for a proper rescue mission. Can we make it 24? Split the difference." 18 hours, and if I'm not back by then, you have my permission to do something spectacularly reckless." The lieutenant cleared her throat pointedly, and Jake realized he was probably pushing his luck with the casual banter. He followed the soldiers outside, where a sleek transport craft was waiting with its engines already warming up. The vehicle was beautiful in the way that all Dominion technology seemed to be, curves and angles that somehow suggested both organic growth and mathematical precision, as if someone had taught geometry to a flower and asked it to design a spacecraft. The short flight to the commandeered City Hall gave Jake a bird's-eye view of the occupation in progress. Dominion forces were establishing control points throughout the colony with the kind of efficient precision that suggested they'd done this many times before. Citizens were being processed through checkpoints, their identities verified and their compliance evaluated by soldiers who seemed genuinely polite about the whole invasion process. "Your people are very well behaved," Lieutenant Velnath commented, apparently noticing his observation. "Most colonies require at least some degree of pacification before full cooperation is achieved." "We're a practical bunch," Jake replied. "Hard to get worked up about politics when you're spending most of your time trying to keep the atmospheric processors working and the local wildlife from eating your livestock." The transport set down on the City Hall's roof, where more soldiers were waiting to escort him inside. The building's familiar corridors had been transformed by the addition of Dominion technology, walls that now pulsed with soft bioluminescent lighting, floors that seemed to absorb sound, and air that carried the faint ozone scent that always accompanied their advanced electronics. They stopped outside the mayor's office, which had apparently been converted into a temporary command center. Through the open doorway, Jake could see banks of holographic displays showing tactical information, colony infrastructure, and what looked like detailed psychological profiles of the local population. "The Admiral will see you now," Lieutenant Velnath announced, stepping aside to let him enter. Jake took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked into the room to face his ex-wife for the first time in 7 years. Zara was standing with her back to him, studying a three-dimensional map of the colony that floated in the air above the mayor's old desk. "She'd changed," he realized immediately, not just the obvious things like the admiral's uniform or the ceremonial scarring that marked her rank, but something deeper. The way she held herself, the quality of attention she brought to the tactical display, the sense of controlled power that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a forge. "Hello, Jake," she said without turning around. "You look terrible." "Well, hello to you too, darling," he replied, falling back on familiar sarcasm to cover his nervousness. "You look like you've been eating well. Conquest obviously agrees with you." She finally turned to face him, and Jake felt his breath catch slightly. 7 years had been kind to her, the angular features of her face had gained a maturity that made her beauty more striking rather than less, and her long ears were adorned with the kind of intricate jewelry that indicated very high rank indeed. But it was her eyes that really caught his attention, the same deep violet that had always reminded him of distant nebulae, now holding depths that suggested she'd seen far more of the universe than either of them had expected when they'd said their wedding vows. "Conquest," she repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what you think this is?" "Well, you did announce the annexation of my home planet over the public address system. Generally speaking, that falls under the category of conquest. Though I suppose you could call it aggressive real estate acquisition if it makes you feel better." Zara's mouth quirked upward in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Still using humor to deflect serious conversations, I see. Some things never change." "Some things do, though," Jake said, gesturing toward her uniform and the command center around them. "Admiral Veltereth. Congratulations, by the way. I always knew you'd go far, I just thought it would be in the diplomatic corps rather than the military. Life rarely follows the plans we make for it," she said quietly. "But thank you. I worked very hard to get here." "I'm sure you did. The question is, what exactly do you want with me? And please don't tell me this is just a social call, because showing up with a fleet tends to send mixed signals about your intentions." Zara gestured toward a chair that definitely hadn't been in the mayor's office that morning, its design flowing like liquid metal frozen in an aesthetically pleasing moment. Jake settled into it cautiously, half expecting it to either analyze his DNA or attempt some form of mind reading. Instead, it simply adjusted to his body temperature and provided what was arguably the most comfortable seating experience of his adult life. "I always forget how paranoid you get around our technology," Zara observed, taking her own seat across from him. "Remember when you spent 3 days convinced that our wedding rings were some kind of surveillance device?" "In my defense, they did glow whenever you were annoyed with me," Jake replied. Which, admittedly, was most of the time toward the end, but still seemed like suspicious behavior for jewelry. "They were mood rings, Jake. Incredibly advanced mood rings, but still just jewelry. Though I'll admit the glowing did get annoying during diplomatic dinners when you'd make one of your inappropriately timed jokes." The holographic displays around them shifted to show real-time feeds from throughout the colony. Jake watched colonists going about their daily business under the watchful eyes of Dominion soldiers, the whole scene having an oddly civilized quality that didn't match his expectations of military occupation. "Your people seem remarkably restrained," he commented. "I was expecting more of the traditional jackboot oppressor approach. Goose-stepping, dramatic speeches about the glory of the empire, maybe some public executions to maintain order." "That's terribly old-fashioned," Zara said with genuine amusement. "Modern conquest is much more efficient. Why destroy valuable infrastructure and terrorize productive citizens when you can simply integrate them into existing systems? Your colony's agricultural output will be much more useful if your farmers aren't cowering in their root cellars." "How pragmatic of you. I'm sure the citizens appreciate the consideration." A new display materialized showing technical specifications that made Jake's eyes water just looking at them. Ships, weapons, defensive systems, all rendered in the kind of detail that suggested Zara wanted him to understand exactly how outmatched any potential resistance would be. "Let me show you something interesting," she said, manipulating the hologram with casual gestures. "This is the current disposition of Earth's remaining fleet forces. 47 ships scattered across 18 systems, most of them obsolete by our standards and all of them desperately trying to protect colonies with resources they simply don't have. Jake studied the tactical display, recognizing several ship configurations from his intelligence briefings. Trying to convince me that resistance is futile? Very Dominion of you. Actually, I'm trying to convince you that cooperation might be beneficial. For everyone involved. The display shifted again, showing supply routes, trade agreements, and what looked like comprehensive economic projections. Your people are excellent at improvisation and creative problem-solving. Our people excel at large-scale organization and technological development. There's potential for genuine mutual benefit here. Assuming we don't mind the minor detail of being conquered first. Integration, Zara corrected. Conquest implies that we're taking something by force. Integration suggests that we're combining resources for everyone's advantage. That's a lovely euphemism, but it doesn't change the fact that you showed up with enough firepower to reduce this planet to a cinder. People tend to notice things like that. Zara's expression grew more serious, and she dismissed the tactical displays with a wave of her hand. Jake, I need you to listen to me very carefully. This isn't about territorial expansion or imperial glory or any of the usual motivations for interstellar warfare. We're facing something that makes our old political disagreements seem like children arguing over toys. She activated a new display, this one showing star charts that stretched far beyond the familiar boundaries of both human and Dominion space. At the very edge of the mapped galaxy, clusters of red indicators pulsed ominously. 3 months ago, our deep space monitoring stations detected massive energy signatures from the galactic rim, she continued. At first, we assumed it was some kind of natural phenomenon, stellar collapse, maybe a previously unknown type of cosmic event. Then our scout ship started disappearing. Jake leaned forward, his diplomatic instincts finally overriding his personal feelings about the situation. Disappeared how? Equipment failure? Hostile action? The last transmission from Scout Group Epsilon was particularly illuminating, Zara said grimly. They reported contact with what they described as geometric entities of impossible size, before their ship's quantum communicator went silent. 2 days later, we found their vessel drifting in space, completely intact but with every piece of organic matter aboard reduced to its component molecules. That's... Jake paused, trying to process the implications. That's genuinely terrifying. But I'm not sure how annexing human colonies is supposed to help with mysterious galactic rim entities. Because those entities aren't staying at the rim, Zara replied, manipulating the star chart to show projected movement patterns. Our analysts estimate they'll reach the core systems within 18 months. Maybe less if they can manipulate spacetime the way some of our data suggests. The red indicators on the map seemed to pulse faster, creating an effect that was probably psychological but felt ominously prophetic nonetheless. Jake found himself calculating jump distances and fleet response times, old habits from his diplomatic career reasserting themselves. So you're building an alliance, he said slowly. Forced integration of human colonies to create a unified defense network. The alternative is letting both our civilizations face extinction separately, Zara said bluntly. I've seen the projections, Jake. Even our combined fleets might not be enough, but they're certainly better than trying to fight this threat with divided forces and incompatible technologies. Jake sat back in his impossibly comfortable chair, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. And you need me because someone has to serve as liaison between the human populations and Dominion administration. Someone who understands both cultures, who has experience with interspecies diplomacy, and who the colonists might actually trust to represent their interests. Someone who used to be married to the conquering admiral, you mean? That doesn't hurt, Zara admitted with a slight smile. Though I was hoping to rely more on your professional qualifications than our personal history. My professional qualifications got me exiled to a frontier colony where I spend my days arguing with malfunctioning hover cars. I'm not exactly at the peak of my diplomatic career. You helped negotiate the Centauri Accords, Zara pointed out. You single-handedly prevented the vegan trade wars from escalating into actual shooting. And you once convinced the entire Andromedan Council that Earth's position on quantum tariffs was based on ancient philosophical principles rather than simple economic self-interest. That last one was mostly creative lying, Jake said. And the Andromedans were gullible enough to believe that humans had ancient philosophical principles about anything. The point is, you're very good at making different species work together toward common goals. Which is exactly what we need right now. A soft chime from one of the remaining displays indicated an incoming communication. Zara touched a control surface, and Lieutenant Velnatha's voice filled the room. Admiral, we're receiving reports of unusual activity in the outer system. Long-range sensors are detecting gravitational anomalies consistent with large vessels dropping out of hyperspace. Zara's expression shifted instantly from diplomatic persuasion to military alertness. Identification. Unknown configuration, Admiral. The energy signatures don't match any known human or Dominion designs. And they're large. Very large. Jake felt his stomach drop as he watched Zara's face go pale. How large? She asked quietly. Initial estimates suggest individual vessels in excess of 50 kilometers length. There appear to be at least 3 of them, possibly more. They're maintaining position at the edge of the system and haven't responded to any communication attempts. Zara closed her eyes for a moment, and Jake could see her running through tactical calculations and strategic options. When she opened them again, her expression was grim. Battle stations, Lieutenant. Full defensive posture but do not engage unless fired upon. And Lieutenant? Start preparing the evacuation protocols for the colony. Understood, Admiral. Velnath out. The communication ended, leaving Jake and Zara sitting in silence while the implications settled around them like radioactive dust. Outside the windows, he could see Dominion soldiers moving with increased urgency, their casual patrol patterns shifting into something more resembling combat readiness. Well, Jake said finally, I have to admit, your timing is impeccable. Nothing says, we need to work together, like the arrival of mysterious giant spaceships right in the middle of our recruitment conversation. This isn't how I wanted to convince you, Zara said quietly. I was hoping we'd have more time to discuss the situation, maybe find some common ground that didn't involve immediate mortal peril. To be fair, immediate mortal peril has always been surprisingly effective at clarifying priorities. Remember the Rigelian food poisoning incident during the trade summit? Nothing builds diplomatic consensus like everyone being equally miserable. Despite the circumstances, Zara actually laughed. I'd forgotten about that. You spent 3 days negotiating treaty terms while we were all taking turns being violently ill. Sometimes you have to work with what the universe gives you, Jake said, standing up from his chair. Speaking of which, I suppose I should formally accept your job offer before those mysterious 50-kilometer ships decide to do something dramatic. You're accepting. Someone has to keep you from making any more unilateral decisions about human colonies. And besides, he added with a grin that felt only slightly forced, it's not like my retirement was going particularly well anyway. The emergency klaxons aboard Zara's flagship had been wailing for the better part of 6 hours, creating a soundtrack that Jake was beginning to find oddly nostalgic. There was something comforting about familiar crisis protocols, even when those protocols involved preparing for potential extinction at the hands of incomprehensibly large alien vessels. I have to say, he commented, watching the tactical displays update with increasingly worrying information, when I woke up this morning, mysterious galaxy-threatening entities weren't even in my top 10 list of things to worry about. I was mostly concerned about Mrs. Patterson's hover car making that grinding noise again. Zara glanced up from the quantum communication array she was calibrating, her fingers dancing across controls that seemed to respond to thought as much as touch. What was number 1 on your list? Whether I had enough synthetic coffee to last until the next supply run. Shows you how dramatically my priorities have shifted in the last few hours. The bridge around them hummed with activity as Dominion officers coordinated with what remained of Earth's scattered fleet elements. Jake found it grimly amusing that it had taken the arrival of an existential threat to finally achieve the kind of human-Dominion cooperation that diplomats had been attempting for decades. "Admiral," came Lieutenant Velnath's voice from the communication station, "we're receiving a transmission from the unknown vessels. It's unusual." "Define unusual, Lieutenant." "The signal appears to be mathematical in nature. Pure information transmitted via quantum entanglement, but structured in ways that don't match any known communication protocols. Our xenolinguistics AI is attempting translation, but progress is slow." Jake moved to the communication station, his diplomatic instincts taking over despite the circumstances. "May I see the raw data?" The display showed cascading streams of symbols that seemed to shift and change even as he watched them. But there was something familiar about the underlying patterns, a mathematical elegance that reminded him of something he'd encountered during his years of interspecies negotiations. "These aren't communication attempts," he said suddenly. "They're credentials. Diplomatic identification codes, but using a mathematical framework so complex that it's taken your computers hours just to recognize them as language." Zara joined him at the station, her violet eyes studying the patterns with the intensity she'd once brought to trade agreement minutiae. "Credentials from whom?" "I think," Jake said slowly, "these might be the people who originally built whatever we've been calling the mysterious entities. And I don't think those ships out there are weapons platforms." "Then what are they?" "Rescue ships." The xenolinguistics AI chose that moment to complete its translation matrix, and the bridge speakers crackled with a voice that managed to sound both ancient and oddly cheerful. "Greetings, local civilizations. This is Archive Vessel Constant Vigilance of the Predecessor Collective. We apologize for the dramatic arrival, but our automated defense systems appear to have malfunctioned rather spectacularly. Are any of you injured? We have excellent medical facilities." The bridge fell silent except for the persistent hum of ship systems and the distant wail of alarms that suddenly seemed rather unnecessary. Jake looked at Zara, who looked back at him with an expression that suggested she was recalculating several months' worth of military planning. "Did that alien intelligence just apologize?" she asked. "And offer medical assistance," Jake added. "I'm starting to think our threat assessment might have been slightly off." Zara activated the communications array with the decisive gesture of someone who had spent her career making important decisions under pressure. "Archive Vessel Constant Vigilance, this is Admiral Zara Veltereth of the Ethereal Dominion Fleet. We would very much like to discuss your malfunctioning defense systems and what happened to our scout ships." "Oh dear," came the reply, somehow managing to convey embarrassment across the vast emptiness of space. "Yes, that was regrettable. Our automated guardians were activated during the Great Departure approximately 50,000 years ago, and we're afraid their threat recognition protocols became somewhat overzealous during our absence. We do hope the molecular disintegration was quick and painless." "Comforting," Jake muttered. "Nothing says, 'we come in peace,' like casual mentions of molecular disintegration. We are prepared to provide full restitution for any inconvenience," the voice continued. "Our archives contain extensive records of both your species, and we believe we have several technologies that might prove beneficial for your continued survival and prosperity." Lieutenant Velnath looked up from her station with the expression of someone who had just realized that her carefully planned military operation had turned into a first contact scenario. "Admiral, we're detecting massive energy surges from the archive vessels. They appear to be building something." The main display shifted to show the outer system, where the three enormous ships were indeed constructing what looked like a complex orbital facility using technology that treated the fundamental laws of physics more like polite suggestions. "That would be our emergency diplomatic station," the predecessor explained helpfully. "We find that first contact situations proceed much more smoothly when all parties have access to proper meeting facilities. And coffee. We've learned that most species negotiate better with adequate caffeine." Jake couldn't help but laugh. "I think I'm going to like these people." The facility will be completed within 2 standard hours, the voice continued. We would be honored to host representatives of both your civilizations for what we hope will be productive discussions about mutual cooperation and the prevention of future accidental molecular disintegrations. Zara deactivated the communication array and turned to face Jake with an expression that mixed relief, exasperation, and what might have been grudging admiration. Well, you were right about the diplomatic credentials. Completely wrong about everything else, but right about that. To be fair, mysterious 50-kilometer ships appearing at the edge of the system doesn't usually lead to offers of coffee and diplomatic stations. I think we can forgive ourselves for assuming the worst. The question now is what we do about the colony integration program, Zara said, gesturing toward the tactical displays that still showed Dominion forces occupying New Haven. The original justification for forced annexation seems to have evaporated rather thoroughly. Jake considered this, watching the construction progress on the alien diplomatic station. Maybe the justification has changed, but the basic idea is still sound. These predecessors obviously have technology that could benefit everyone, and they seem to prefer dealing with unified governmental structures rather than fragmentary political entities. You're suggesting we continue with the integration, but on a voluntary basis? I'm suggesting we give people a choice. Present the situation honestly, including the new information about benevolent ancient aliens with helpful technology, and let each colony decide whether they want to be part of a larger coalition or remain independent. Zara nodded slowly. It would certainly be more in keeping with diplomatic tradition. And less likely to result in armed resistance movements that would complicate future negotiations. Plus, Jake added with a grin, it means I get to keep my job as liaison without the moral complications of representing a conquered population. Win-win. Lieutenant Velnatha's voice interrupted their conversation. Admiral, we're receiving a priority transmission from the colony surface. Lieutenant Colonel Chen requests immediate consultation regarding civilian evacuation procedures. Tell her the evacuation is cancelled, Zara replied. And ask her to prepare the colony leadership for a rather unusual diplomatic briefing. As the bridge crew began implementing the new directives, Jake found himself standing next to Zara at the main viewport, watching the alien construction project transform empty space into something that looked like a university campus designed by someone with a very optimistic view of interspecies cooperation. You know, he said quietly, when we got divorced, I never imagined we'd end up working together to establish humanity's first diplomatic relations with ancient alien civilizations. When we got divorced, Zara replied, I was mostly focused on not throwing your collection of vintage Earth music recordings out the airlock. Long-term planning wasn't really a priority. For what it's worth, I think we make a pretty good team. Professionally speaking. Professionally speaking, she agreed, though her smile suggested she might be thinking about more than just professional collaboration. The communication system chimed again, and the cheerful predecessor voice filled the bridge. We should mention that our diplomatic station includes excellent recreational facilities, including what your species would recognize as a full-service restaurant and entertainment complex. We find that negotiations proceed much more smoothly when all parties are comfortable and well-fed. Jake looked at Zara, who looked back at him with an expression of shared amusement that felt remarkably familiar despite the years that had passed. Well, he said, I suppose we should prepare for the most comfortable diplomatic crisis in human history. Speak for yourself, Zara replied. I still have to explain to my superiors why I conquered a colony in order to protect it from a threat that turned out to be a friendly welcome party. Look on the bright side, Jake said as they headed toward the transport bay to begin what was likely to be the most important diplomatic mission of their careers. At least you'll have good coffee and excellent recreational facilities while you're doing it. Outside the viewport, the stars wheeled on in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of mortals learning to work together in an universe far stranger and more welcoming than any of them had dared to imagine.